Good evening, YouTubers. The new time travel behind me, 88. I'm back with another Doctor Who DVD review. And yes, we're still celebrating Doctor Who's 50th anniversary. Tonight, I am going to do Doctor Who, Generations of the Doctor, fan favorite episode. That's right, I'm picking 3 stories each from the 11 Doctors era. And then you have to comment down below to tell me what are 3 stories that you pick from the 11 Doctors era. All of it. And for a chance for a possible shout out in my next video. So let's get started. Let's begin with Doctor Who, An Unearthly Child. This is a good 4-part adventure. Stars William Hartnell, William Russell, and Jacqueline Hill and Carol Ann Ford. I love this episode. It's a great episode. The other 3 are quite underrated. Originally transmitted on November 23rd to December 14th, 1963. This is the best episode ever. Next up, I pick from the First Doctor era, The Reign of Terror. This is the best 6-part story ever, and it's one of my favorite William Hartnell stories ever. I love this episode. This particular episode originally transmitted on August 8th to September 12th, 1964. Yep, August 8th through to September 12th. Good episode. And finally, the Time Edler. This is the best Hartnell story ever. And I love this episode. Peter Butterworth did a wonderful job playing the meddling monk. This story originally transmitted on July 3rd to the 24th, 1965. And that concludes the William Hartnell era. Let's move on to the second Doctor era, Patrick Troughton. The Tomb of the Cybermen. This is the best Patrick Troughton story ever. And Tesla Coils recommends this Cyberman story. I love this episode. And even though this is a special edition of the story, the 4-part adventure originally transmitted on September 2nd to the 23rd, 1967. And has some good directing and good story writing. The Invasion. Great 8-part story. I love this episode. The animation on the first and 4 episodes are brilliant and fantastic. This story originally transmitted on November 2nd to December 21st, 1968. And finally, The War Games. The best Troughton story ever, and sadly to see the second Doctor go. This adventure originally transmitted on April 19th to June 21st, 1969. And that concludes the Patrick Troughton era. Let's move on to the third Doctor, John Pertwee. I pick The Ambassadors of Death. Brilliant 7-part story. I love this episode. The colorization on the second episode 2 through 7 are breathtaking. The best Pertwee story ever. This adventure originally transmitted on March 21st to May 2nd, 1970. The Mine of Evil. Brilliant 6-part story. I love this episode. The colorization of episode 1 is fantastic, thanks to Mr. Stuart Humphrey. And the episode 2 through 6 color recovery, fantastic. This story, 6-part adventure, originally transmitted on January 30th to March 6, 1971. And finally, Death to the Dalek. Another brilliant Pertwee story. This is one of the best Pertwee stories of the 11th season. It's fantastic. This 4-part story originally transmitted on February 23rd to March 16th, 1974. And that concludes the Jon Pertwee era. Let's move on to the 4th Doctor, Tom Baker. Robot. This is one of the best Tom Baker stories ever, which reminds me of King Kong. I agree with I Squished a Pancake Lauren. Sadly, she's no longer on YouTube. But this is best story. And it also has the continuity of the Pertwee era. This story originally transmitted on December 28th, 1974 to January 18th, 1975. Genesis of the Dalek. The best Tom Baker story and one of the best episodes ever. It's a classic. The first appearance is of Davros. This story originally transmitted on March 8th to April 12th, 1975. And finally, in the Tom Baker era, The Deadly Assassin. Brilliant 4-part story. I love this episode when the Doctor travels alone without Sarah Jane. This story originally transmitted on October 30th to November 20th, 1976. And that concludes the Tom Baker era. Let's move on to the 5th Doctor, Peter Davison, with Earthshock. This is the brilliant Peter Davison episode. It's a classic, and I love this episode. Sadly, the departure of Matthew Waterhouse. This story originally transmitted on March 8th through the 16th, 1982. Next story I pick from the 20th season, Snake Dance. This is a brilliant story. I love this episode. Martin Clumes did a wonderful job playing Laon. This 4-part story originally transmitted on January 18th and the 19th and the 25th to the 26th, 1983. And I pick the multi-story, The 5 Doctors. Brilliant story, and it's a great multi-doctor story. I love this episode. This adventure originally transmitted on November 25th, 1983. Let's move on to the 6th Doctor era, Colin Baker. Attack of the Cybermen. This is the brilliant Colin Baker story ever, and marks the return of the Cybermen. Great story. This adventure originally transmitted on January 5th to the 12th, 1985. Next story is Vengeance of Varus. Brilliant story. I love this episode. And Jason Connery did a wonderful job performing this episode. This adventure originally transmitted on January 19th to the 26th, 1985. And finally, Time Lash. This is the best episode. I love this episode. And the monster thing almost looked like the Muppet. This adventure, Time Lash, originally broadcast on March 9th to the 16th, 1985. And that concludes the Colin Baker era. Let's move on to the 7th Doctor, Sylvester McCoy. Remembrance of the Dalek. This is one of the best Sylvester McCoy stories ever. I love this episode. It is fantastic to watch. This 4-part story originally transmitted on October 5th to the 26th, 1988. The next story I pick, The Greatest Show in the Galaxy. Yes, this is one of the another great Sylvester McCoy era stories. I love this episode. It is fantastic. This 4-part story, originally broadcast on December 14th, 1988 to January 4th, 1989. And finally, The Curse of the Fenric. This is the best episode. I love this episode. It is fantastic. This and Sylvester McCoy, wonderful job in this episode. Originally transmitted for this episode, October 5th through November 15th, 1989. And that concludes the Sylvester McCoy era. Let's move on to Paul Mcgann, which one story is Doctor Who, the movie. Yep, the TV movie is the best episode. Eric Roberts did a wonderful job portraying the Master. This story originally transmitted on May 14th, 1996. And that concludes the Paul Mcgann era. Let's move on to Christopher Eccleston with the first series that I picked for this episode, Rose. This is the best episode to open up the first series. I love this episode. Also, Father's Day, one of the best episodes yet ever. I love this great emotional story. And also, The Parting of the Ways, great ending to end the Christopher Eccleston era. And that concludes the Christopher Eccleston story. Let's move on to David Tennant. And here's what I picked for this episode. Smith and Jones, the best episode ever. I love this episode. It is fantastic. Also, from Series 4 is Partners in Crimes. Great episode. Marks the reunite of the Doctor and Donna. And a final episode that I pick is Journey's End. The best episode I love. Great episode. And that concludes the David Tennant era. Let's move on to Matt Smith from Series 5. I pick the 11th hour. This is the best episode I love. A great opening from the 11th Doctor. Amy's Choice. Another fantastic episode. And The Big Band. Great ending for Series 5. And that's when Amy and Rory get married. And that concludes the Doctor Who Generations of the Doctor's fan favorite episode. Shout out goes to Douglas E. Wolf. And don't forget to comment down below to tell me what are 3 stories that you picked from 11 Doctors era. Okay, and you'll for a chance for a shout out. I'll see you guys next week. Next time, take care.